All right. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Bob Walker, and I'm the leader of the customer solutions team at Octopus Deploy. And joining me is Shawn Sesna, one of our senior solutions architects on the customer solutions team. And today we're going to be talking to you about rollback strategies with Octopus Deploy. Shawn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, Bob. I've had my morning caffeine. I'm ready to get going.
Yeah, I'm super excited to dive into this webinar. I think it's going to be a really interesting topic. But before we do that, just a little bit of housekeeping. First up, a link of the recording will be emailed to you. Typically, that happens within about 24 to 48 hours. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and ask them in the Zoom Q&A if you're joining us on Zoom. We greatly appreciate that. It makes it a lot easier for us to keep track of those questions. And if you're using one of our streaming platforms, please join us in our community Slack and join the webinar channel. And if it's the first time that you've joined us on a community Slack, go ahead and throw in an intro because we'd love to know a little bit more about you. All right, the agenda for today. First, Shawn and I are going to have a bit of a discussion around rollbacks. Then what we're going to do is we're going to move on to some demonstrations to show you how to make a few modifications to your existing deployment processes to better support rollbacks. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with some Q&A. Before we do dive in, I do want to point out that this webinar is not going to cover blue-green style deployments, canary or red-black. While we do think that those are incredibly important, and if you have the capabilities and the application supports it, 100% do it. Can't promote it enough. However, it is a rather large change. Not only do you change how you deploy, but you're also changing how you write your code, how you make your database changes, how you monitor your software, and how you test it. It's a pretty big change. And what we'd rather focus on instead is a very common scenario. And now, Shawn, I can't speak just for myself, but I know I made this mistake more than anyone, which was I would push code to test by accident, and there'd be some sort of blocking bug or show-stopping bug that would block our QA team for hours at a time.
Yeah, that's happened to us quite a few times. The easiest method that we found was just go ahead and redeploy the last known good version or release, sorry, and just go from there.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. I mean, that drives us right into our first conversation topic, which is what is a rollback? And that's getting back to a known good state by redeploying a previous release. Now, this is something that was interesting to me because as I started working on this particular webinar and samples and documentation and all that other good stuff, at first I was thinking, hey, rollbacks, that's a production problem, but really it's more of a dev test and staging problem than a production problem. And Shawn, you mentioned that you roll back to previous releases. Did you do that mostly in your dev and test environment, or were you doing that in production as well?
We did it mostly in dev test. We deployed often enough that usually when we went to production, it was a non-issue and we knew it was going to work, so we didn't have to worry about it too much. Though we did have one instance where we actually had to stop the app completely and accept that data loss from the database.
Oh, that's rough when that happens. Oh, yeah, and but that does bring up a really interesting point, which is you're deploying to dev and test a heck of a lot more times than you're deploying to production, and so you might be deploying to say test 20 times a day, and on the 21st deployment, oops, I made a mistake. Okay, let's go back to that 20th deployment, and everything should be all good. And then finally, we want to prevent that bad release from being promoted. So if you had a release that you rolled back from in test, you obviously don't want to deploy that to staging or production. But I do want to highlight a little bit that not all releases should be or could be rolled back. Now, Shawn, in your experience, when you were doing those rollbacks in your testing environment, what were some of the conditions that you knew that, yes, I could in fact roll this back or redeploy the previous release?
Most of the time, it had to do with database changes. We had
Mhm.
with database changes that we had in place, you really couldn't roll back very well if there were some. But since it kept track of what had already been run,
Mm.
sometimes you could get away with the fact that there weren't any database changes, so it was just code, and you could just go ahead and roll back pretty easily.
Yeah, and that really highlights the very big, I guess, like the third bullet point, which is it's zero to minimal coupling with other apps in the database. So if you didn't have any database changes, you have no coupling whatsoever, and you're really just kind of making some behind the scene code changes. I also found that I would make a lot of styling and markup only changes or JavaScript changes because the app I was working on was a Angular app, and so if all I was doing is making some UI changes, then much higher success a chance of rolling back, especially when you're deploying a test and you're deploying 20 times a day. Um, the, the the difference is so small, and so that's when you know, yes, I can in fact roll back. But now this is a big one, which is, I picked this particular scenario for a very particular reason, which is it's a massive change set. I did a quarterly deployment to production last night, let's say 8 p.m., and now it's 10 a.m., and our users are in the systems and finding bugs. And in this case, now, Shawn, I never had a chance to try to even roll back because that was never even entered my thought because there's just so much risk in that case.
There is, and that, I mentioned that thing that we did before, where we did have a bad production release. We thought everything. We tried to think of everything we could do to uh, recover from that, but there was an unfortunate circumstance where we just had to shut the app down and accept the fact that we lost 4 hours worth of data entry. It looked really bad on us. Stakeholders were not happy, but if we were to allow it to continue, it just would have been really bad.
Yeah, and in that case, I mean, it would have been, I guess, much more preferable if you could roll forward. But in that case, you're like, the only option that's available to us is like we have to roll back. But most of the time, that the only chance of really success, I mean, to not make your stakeholders angry, is that you have to roll forward because it's such a large change set, or you have so much time that's between your last deployment, 4 hours worth of data changes. I mean, that's a pretty significant amount of data changes that you lost.
Yeah, it wasn't one of my finer moments in my position, but the stakeholders understood that if we let it continue, it would have been exponentially worse.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, I completely understand. I do want to highlight this, and we talked about this before, but if you have tightly coupled database and code changes, you have to do a roll forward otherwise you are going to encounter the data loss, like Shawn said. Um, and one of the nice things is that we in fact have a couple of webinars coming up with one of our colleagues, Alex Yates, who's going to talk about how you can decouple some of your database and code changes so you don't have to have this type of requirement. But I really want to highlight this, that if you have tightly coupled database and code changes, roll forward is going to be your only option. All right, I'm going to dive a little bit into the rollback strategy. So what's going to happen when we do a rollback, and why do we want to think about this? Because Shawn, I mean, you mentioned that all we did is redeploy your previous release, but you probably ran some additional steps that you didn't really need to run, right?
Yeah, actually, all the database steps were still there. In those instances, it was pretty easy just to go into the deployment and exclude them so that they didn't run. But yeah, for the most part, we just let it run everything that was there.
Yeah, and I guess that really highlights kind of a big thing, is that you want to skip certain steps, but you might also want to run some additional steps if you're doing a rollback. But first up, you definitely need to detect if a rollback is happening. And that brings us up to our next thing, which is what we're going to talk about a little bit today, which is the deployment mode. Now, when I say deployment mode, what I'm referring to is obviously if there's a difference between deployment, which is pretty easy to calculate. I'm deploying a release with a release number greater than the previous one. And the rollback's the inverse of that. But this was rather interesting again to me when we started working on this webinar, which was I have a greater than, I have a less than, but what happens when I'm doing an equal to? And we didn't really think about this, but we started talking about this a little bit more and more as we were working on this, right, Shawn?
Yeah, those are those cases where you've brought another server online and it does need to be redeployed, so everything has to run.
Oh yeah. Yeah, but at the same time, you probably only want to run even a smaller subset of those steps than you would running with even a rollback or a deployment, because maybe you definitely don't need to redeploy your database changes, but there's probably additional maybe backend services that you don't need to run during a redeployment as well. Now, the nice thing about this is calculating that it is possible. We provide all the necessary system variables for you, but we wanted to make that as easy as possible. So we added a new step template to our community library called Calculate Deployment Mode. And it does a number of different things, more than just calculate whether or not it's a deploy, rollback, or redeploy. It will also tell you the version difference, whether or not it's an identical or like if it's a major, minor build or revision, tell you how the deployment was triggered, either manually, meaning like a person clicked on the deploy button, or we had a script with an API key, or is caused by a trigger such as a schedule trigger or a deployment target trigger. And then what we'll do is we'll set a number of different output variables for you. On top of that, we're also going to set some run condition variables, and we'll get into run conditions in just a little bit. But the big thing to kind of keep in mind is that they're there for us to leverage. So it handles a lot of the comparisons within Octostash, so you don't have to do that for you. So it can say, hey, I want to run on deploy, and it will basically say when deployment mode equals deploy, or run on deploy or rollback when deployment mode is deploy or rollback. So let's jump in. I believe the next step, yep, is definitely the demo. So let's jump over to our demonstration. And this is an application, Shawn, I'm sure you've seen plenty of times, our good old OctoFX friend.
Absolutely. I've deployed it many times myself.
And let's talk about what this process looks like. By first, what we're going to do is we're actually going to roll back to this particular step. That's going to be this particular version, 9.9.8. And to do that, what we're going to do is we'll just click on the redeploy button. And for a lot of people, for a lot of individuals, this actually works out quite well. And you know, Shawn, you were doing this, it sounds like in a previous role. But as you can see, we are running the database creation runbook as well as the database step to deploy that database package, in addition to all the other the Windows service and the website. But you'll also notice that there's an additional step in here that we don't have on the deployment process. And this might be another one of those cases where, hey, I'm running a step I really don't want to run at this particular point in time during a rollback. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But it really also highlights one of the dangers of redeploying a previous release is you might have some additional steps in there that you've removed that you may not want to run during a rollback. Now, as we're waiting for this to finish up, so this should finish up pretty quickly, we also talked about blocking a release or preventing a release. So we just roll back to 9.9.8. But as you can see, because 9.9.9 is successful, I can go ahead and I can deploy this up to test if I so desired. Now, this was one of those features I didn't know about until I started working at Octopus Deploy. Were you aware of the prevent progression before you started working here, Shawn?
Yeah, it was one of those things that we knew was there, but we never actually used. The way that our organization was structured was that the team lead was the one who was responsible for doing the deployments. He was already not he. They were always aware of what versions weren't good, so they just didn't deploy them. So we just never really used the feature.
Yeah, and that was kind of the same way where I was, because I was one of the team leads. I was like, oh, don't use that one, use this one instead. What's nice about this is the prevent progression. I can just add in a note. In my case, I'm just going to call it demo. And once I do that, a couple things happen. A big red scary box appears on the screen. In addition to that, you'll notice that the deploy button was removed from test, as well as obviously it would never appear in production. But if we wanted to, we could redeploy back to dev. Maybe we think we fixed it. Maybe it was a connection string issue, or is a user permission issue, or any number of those different things. And what we can do is we also can go to the overview screen, and you can see there's a red exclamation point, and you can't deploy to test. And it'll even tell you why it cannot be deployed to test. But so what we're going to do now is we're going to make that process a little bit smoother by adding in some automation, by adding in a couple extra steps, and skipping over some other bits and pieces. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to add in that library step template, calculate deployment mode. Now, one thing I like to do is I like to add notes to my deployment process. Shawn, I was really excited when this was added in, I think it was 2020.5, and I've been overusing it quite a bit. I don't know about yourself.
I'll be honest, I've never really used it until we started working on the rollback stuff.
Yeah, and I didn't start using it probably till a few months ago, maybe earlier this year, because I mean it's been around for a while, but once I started using it, I've been overusing it. And once I figured out you could do markdown, so I can close this down and I can see this is what it's going to look like when I see the deployment process overview screen. So I have this nice bold text, hey, this always runs. Now I don't want to run this at the very end of my deployment. I want to run this at the start. And I only want to run it on the Octopus server. Or I can run it on a worker. I only need to run it once. I don't need to run it any other time. And this is probably the first step template I've ever worked on that I haven't had any parameters. If you're very familiar with some of the other step templates I've authored, it seems like I love parameters, and that's for a reason. But what we want to do next up is we want to go ahead and we're going to skip this next step. Let's move this over. When we're doing a rollback. And the way that we're going to do this is using a variable run condition. And variable run conditions was something I dabbled in just a little bit when I was before I started working on Octopus Deploy, but I've really I'm thinking I'm starting to abuse them almost because I use them almost all the time. Shawn, did you kind of have that similar experience, or was it slightly different?
Back when I was a customer, I would probably put myself still in noob status. There was, I thought I had a good handle on Octopus Deploy, but when I joined the team, I realized how much I didn't know and how much I wasn't using.
Yeah, and I was kind of in the same boat, especially when it came down to run conditions. I learned even doing this, preparing for this particular webinar, I learned a couple of other things. The number one is that if I type in this, so what this is doing is it's basically evaluating the expression to see if it's a truthy value. So obviously, if you type in true, it's going to be a truthy value. That's the same as me clicking on this radio button, this always run radio button. So these variable run conditions are always evaluated, even if there's a success or a failure in the previous steps. And I think it's really important to highlight that because you might run steps that you don't expect to run. But what we can do is we can control that a little bit. And by adding in, first up, this is the output variable that's out there. And this is what was generated by that calculate deployment mode. And as you can see, it does run on deploy. But what you can also see in here is you'll see this unless statement. And what this is doing is it's basically saying, only run this if there's no error. If there is an error, go ahead and skip this particular step. So basically, it will return false if there's an error. So that's the equivalent of clicking on success, but adding in this additional run condition. Now, if you only want to run this on a failure, which I think there's a very valid reason why you run some steps on a rollback failure, you would just change this over to be an if statement. It's as simple as that. I'll go ahead and I'll just change that back to unless. And then the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to change step number 3 to only run on rollback. Only run on deploy. So steps 2 and 3 are only going to run on deployments now. Now, we've talked about redeployments a little bit, but this is one of those cases where we probably don't want to run this Windows service deployment again if we're doing a redeployment. And so that's where this other run condition will come into play, a variable run condition. And instead of just run on deploy, this is run on deploy or rollback. And what we can see here is this is very simple. It's exactly what it says right here, run on deploy or rollback. So these are all available. So you can see these are all of the output, or excuse me, the run conditions that you can take advantage of. And we'll probably want to do the same thing on our verify application as well. Like we don't want to run this if it's a redeploy. It doesn't make a lot of sense if we're redeploying something that's already in production. It's already been approved. We don't need to constantly reapprove it or anything like that. So Shawn, we talked a little bit about the prevent release progression, and I showed you how to kind of walk through it, but I'm not a big fan of those manual steps. Are you?
No, not really. If I'm going to do a rollback, I want it to be all done automatically.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why we added in this block release progression step. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add in my notes because I love my notes. And especially since it says run this on rollbacks only. And you can also see that I have some grammar issues apparently. But this does have some parameters, and I have a couple of them already pre-filled out. So I'll go ahead and add the key. If you're using this for just straight up rollbacks, I would leave everything as is and just populate the key and the reason. And what I'm going to do for this case is I'm going to run this. I'm going to hard code this, reason to just be something very simple. I roll back to this release number. And just like before, I want a variable run condition. and I only want to run this on rollback. I'm not a big fan of running this at the very end of. I like to have my notify stakeholders happen at the very, very, very end, so everyone knows, yes, this deployment is complete. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to click on the save button. And so now this is the deployment process. So we've made a few tweaks to it. We've added 2 new steps, calculate and block. And then we modified steps 2, 3, 4, and 6 to have variable run conditions. If we had the time, what I would do is I would go in and I would add in some additional notes so I knew that, hey, this runs on deploy only, this runs on rollback only, and so on and so forth. But what I want to do now is we're going to go ahead and create a couple of releases and deploy them really quickly. So that's going to be queued up, which is fine. And let's just jump over to the releases and go to 10. And the reason why we're doing this is because I want to show you what the rollback process looks like. But in order to show you that, I have to deploy 2 releases. I have to deploy 10 or .10, and then I have to deploy .11, and then I want to roll back to .10. But while we're waiting for that to fire, I can kind of walk you through a little bit of what's going on. First up, as you can see, the calculate deployment mode calculated as deploy, and it does write this information to your logs or to this main screen every single time. And I kind of thought through this a little bit, and I was like, for a lot of folks, the first time they see this is, this is where the most important information is because it shows you how to use the step template. It shows you all of the variable run conditions. It includes the exact one you can copy in there, and then also shows you how to make the, always run success or failure as well. And so again, this will always appear every single time that you run this particular step. But now, as we can see, block release progression, that was skipped because this is a deployment. Let's jump over. Now we can see that 9.11 was successful as well. No big surprise there. And it ran for took about 33 seconds to finish doing this. Now let's go ahead and let's roll back to .10. Since this is not the most recent release, go ahead and redeploy. And then what we're going to see is this is going to say, hey, this is a rollback, and that's what we saw. And we can see the version change and the trigger. Now we can see that steps 2 and 3 were skipped because there's no reason to rerun them. And we'll see steps 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 run. 6 is skipped because that only runs in test and production. So that took 19 seconds. So we knocked off about 14 seconds after our deployment. So we got back up and running much quicker. And we can come back up here and we can see that .11 has now been blocked. So we can't deploy this at all. Now, one of the interesting things about this, Shawn, is that we are redeploying the Windows service and the website. And now when you do this, and this is kind of like one of those inner workings of how Octopus Deploy works, it's re-extracting out the package, rerunning all of your variable replacements, rerunning any sort of scripts inside of there. And this can be quick, or this can be a little bit slow. And Shawn, this is something that you've seen in your testing with some of the other applications, because I'm using .NET, but you're using Java and Kubernetes.
That's right. There is a difference in that's something I was going to tackle in the demo I was going to show, in that how Tomcat handles the operations that you just spoke about.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and we'll switch over to your particular screen, and you can kind of walk us through some of the changes that you made that are more natively supported within Tomcat to make that whole deployment, or excuse me, that rollback process even faster.
Yeah. So what Bob was talking about is with all that re-extraction stuff with Tomcat, it actually does a little bit more. So it does the extraction, it does the structured variable replacement, but then it also runs this piece here, which is it repackages the WAR to hand off to Tomcat. So if your application is kind of big, that potentially could take quite some time. So we're going to go ahead and hop into the process that I've defined for this. Actually, no. Let me switch strategies here. Bob, have you ever used Tomcat before?
No, I haven't. I think this is the first time I've even heard of a Tomcat web application manager, to be completely honest.
So Tomcat's actually got a really cool feature. It came out in Tomcat version 7. It's called parallel deployments. And
Hmm,
what this does is allows you to deploy two versions of the same application at the same time. How
interesting.
that how that works is once the new version of the application comes online, new sessions for that app are directed to the new version, but it allows the older sessions that are already there to naturally bleed off until they start going on to the new one. And eventually your application will have no sessions left on that older version.
Hmm, that's really cool. So does it, I see it also, it looks like you have the same path, so you don't have to do any sort of like path manipulation or any sort of like configuration trickery or anything like that.
Yeah, there's no trickery here. There's no load balance type stuff that you have to worry about. And this is something that Tomcat can just do by itself, which, it's really cool. In this particular instance, you can see that 26.0 is not running and 26.1 is running. There's a little bit of a quirk with the pet clinic application that I have that does something weird with the database. So two versions can't be running at the same time. If there's anybody who's more competent in Java out there who knows how to fix that, I'd like to talk to you. Uh, but for this demonstration, this is how it's going to work. We still have them both deployed, but only one is running. So I'm going to go ahead and go kind of walk you through the process that I've defined for this Tomcat rollback. And some of it's going to look familiar already. I start off with that calculate deployment mode because that's just really key to doing this rollback strategy. The next thing that I did was I added a manual intervention to prompt the user for the reason why you're doing a rollback. Um,
Hmm.
and then I take this reason and I feed it into the block progression as the reason.
That's brilliant. Yeah, I never even thought of doing that. That's awesome. Yeah, because like you say, every single time you roll back, it's probably going to be a slightly different reason, and having the ability to enter that in even as part of your deployment, or excuse me, your rollback. That's great. You get the exact same functionality as you do on the other screen, but it's all automated.
Yeah, it works out really, really well. It gives you a nice, clear reason of what's going on. And similar to what Bob did on his, is I'm going to be skipping these database steps. So I put in my notes as well because it's not apparent from, like, let's just say if you're going to this process screen without these notes, I don't know which ones are being skipped.
Hmm.
So I mean, that was when Bob told me about, oh, just use the notes feature. I said that's really, really great because it gives me a clear indication as to which one's going to be running when. Um, for the reasons that I spoke of previously, I have included this start stop Tomcat application step, and it's going to be stopping the previously deployed version if one exists. So if this was the first time I've ever deployed, it's not going to be there, and this step will be skipped. But if there is one, it's going to stop that before trying to deploy the next one, which is here. And the feature that we were using to supply that version number has actually existed in this Tomcat step that we have for quite some time.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't really notice it was there. I saw this advanced options, and this is kind of how I discovered the parallel deployments feature in the first place. Is it just says it right here.
You just clicked on a link. Oh, wow! I kind of solved the problem myself. Yay me!
Yes, so when I joined this campaign to work on with Bob, he's like, I want let's do a Java rollback. I'm like, cool. How do I do that? And I found this and I was like, oh, well, that makes it easy.
Yeah.
So in this case, I'm just providing the release number as the deployment version number so that it's just easy to tie which one is which. Um, in a rollback scenario, I'm starting the older version of the application. And the last bit to the changes that I made that were different from Bob's is this undeploy Tomcat VM manager. This is not a built-in template. This is one that I wrote specifically for this scenario. Um, Octopus Deploy does its best to keep your targets clean with those retention policies and removing ones that are no longer necessary. But once Octopus has handed off the WAR file to Tomcat, that's where its interaction ends. It doesn't really know where it goes after that. So if you have older versions, if you're using the parallel deployments feature and you have older versions out there, Octopus Deploy is not going to clean those up by himself. So in a rollback scenario, I've added this step just to go ahead and remove it from the server so it doesn't accidentally get started. Someone saying, oh, that's a new version. That's the one that should be running. So as you saw from this screen, I have two deployments out there already. So we'll go ahead and do a rollback to .0. And we'll just hit redeploy here. And the first thing it's going to do is it's going to prompt me for that reason. And this is pet clinic, so I'll just say unable to create new pets, which would be a really big problem for a pet clinic.
That'd be a massive problem for a pet clinic.
Yeah, it's kind of a showstopper. So we'll go ahead and let that go through. Get that picked up. And here we are. We're stopping the previous version. It's been stopped. You can kind of go out and verify here. Both of them are now stopped. And it's actually skipping the deployment because it doesn't need to do that. As we were talking about, it's already done the extraction. It's already done the variable replacement. It doesn't need to do that again. So I'm just going to have it start the new version or the older version. Let's see, is it gotten to a running state quite yet? Not quite yet. So these are running on a Raspberry Pi, which aren't the most performant in the world. But there we go. And we can take a look.
Awesome.
And it's been started, and the older version has been removed. Just pop this open here. And there we have it. So for Tomcat, we utilize the best of both worlds in this scenario by combining the features of Octopus with the features of Tomcat to have a fairly robust rollback strategy. And this all took 1 minute to do that. Had it been not on a Raspberry Pi, probably would have been a bit quicker. But that's the hardware I'm working with today.
I mean, even then, going back, if you get back to a working state in a minute, that's not too bad at all. I mean, compared to 6 hours, that's a heck of a lot better.
This is true. This is true. There is one that's actually even quicker.
Really?
That's Kubernetes.
Really?
That one was really fun to work with. So within Kubernetes, I'm not sure how much Kubernetes have you worked with, Bob?
Outside of our just built-in step and deploying some sample projects to get myself familiar with some concepts, that's about the extent of it. I'm not familiar with like the underlying structure, or don't ask me about any sort of kubectl stuff. Not good stuff will come out of my mouth then.
So I'm not like an expert in this technology at all. So when I started looking into it, I wasn't quite sure how to do a rollback in this either. But what I discovered, and this is something that people may already know, is that when you do a deployment in Kubernetes, it actually keeps a revision history. And so by running a command like this, you can actually see that it's kept a revision history. Out of the box, if you hadn't made any changes to Octopus Deploy, and this is something that I'll cover in a minute, that change cause is going to be empty. But so what I've done here is I've tied the release number to the revision. And I can show you how that's done. It's actually super, super simple. Get up my projects here and come into this project. And the one that we're going to be talking about is this Pet Clinic web deployment. And all I had to do was come down to this deployment annotations and add that.
Okay, so that Kubernetes, that's just it just knows that it's going to translate that to whatever we just saw on the kubectl screen.
That's correct. This is the annotation that needs to be applied, and I just added the version number.
Gotcha.
And then that's where that's how I can get this to be tied.
Hmm.
So the deployment process here is somewhat similar to the one that we just saw, in that I'm just go to script changes here. Again, I've added notes just so I can keep track of what's going on. Um, for the rollback, I am going to be skipping the MySQL container and the flyway job because those are database changes. Those aren't the
Mm-hmm.
ones I want to run. I just really want to roll this back. But in this particular scenario, none of these are actually going to run.
Yeah, okay.
And what's going to roll back is this kubectl script here that I wrote that is going to parse the revision history, look for the release number that's currently being deployed, and then issue the rollback command to that. And these actually run super duper quick. So I'll do the same thing as I did before. Go out to my releases, and I'm going to roll back to this one here. Hit that redeploy button. Again, it's going to prompt me for a reason. Let's let that come up. Be really lazy, just tell it to do it.
That is the downside of prompting like that.
It is. I mean, when you're doing a demo, it's like I don't really care about this, but it is a really important step that you can provide that really descriptive reason as to why you're rolling back. So it does actually work out in the long run. But
Yeah.
during
Yeah, I'd probably do a little bit of A, a little bit of B. I would have like some static text at the very beginning, and then populate whatever someone entered into the manual intervention.
So here we are. It's searching the
Oh,
revision
wow.
history for that version number. It found it. It issued the rollback, and it's rolled back. So we come back here and we rerun that. We can see that revision 3 is
Hmm.
now back to that other version number. And that's all I had to do. And that was super quick. It ran in, 38 seconds. And that's including the pause for that rollback reason.
Wow. Yeah, that is really fast. I mean, getting back up and running within less than a minute, that's even better.
Yeah, I was super happy when I found that. It actually turned out to be really easy to implement. The most difficult part was just trying to figure out how to get that annotation in there. But a
Mhm.
couple of quick Google searches, and it was done.
And one thing I really like about this is that we've included these additional steps. You've added these bits and pieces in here, and yeah, that does make your deployment process a little bit more robust. You have a couple more steps in there, but you can test this relatively easily. You can test this on dev. You can test this on test and staging before you go to production. So okay, there's a pretty good chance, even if I have to roll back, and it falls into one of the scenarios like we've been talking about, a cone only change, pretty small change set, and so on. Uh, you know it's going to work. You have a pretty high chance it's going to work. You're not trying to make this up as you go along.
Yeah, that's right. It's going back to one of the pillars of Octopus Deploy. It's a repeatable process. It's
Mm-hmm.
reliable and it's consistent.
And you know exactly what's going to happen too, which is what I really like. Like I can look in the logs and I can see this is going to happen. These are the steps that we're going to take. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that wraps it up for the demonstration for today. I think we're just going to go ahead and move on to some Q&A. Awesome. So we got a couple of questions coming in. We've had a couple more questions get asked over the webinar. So first up, I just saw just dropped right into our Q&A, into the chat. What happens if I choose an older than one release earlier to redeploy? And I assume that's probably for Kubernetes or Tomcat. And Shawn, I'll be kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
As long as those revisions are, let me back up. In the case of Kubernetes, as long as you haven't made your revision history um, too short and that the revision still exists, you should be able to do as I demonstrated and roll back quickly. And that kind of goes along with Tomcat as well. If if that version that you're wanting to roll back to is still deployed onto Tomcat, it should just work as you saw in the demonstration.
Yeah, yeah. And for like the IIS ones, like the ones that I was showing, for example, because it's doing a complete redeployment, as long as those packages are still there and those releases are still there, it will work just as you expect it to work. Again, because you are doing that redeployment. That's one of the advantages of that approach over the approach that Shawn was showing you, which that has the benefit of being much faster, and you get a lot more. Yeah, I'd say not just faster, but it's also you get up and back up and running a lot quicker. But yeah, the downside is then you do have that kind of that risk on something like that. Another question just came in. How do you roll back when there's a database change that is not referenced in the old version of the release? Ooh, that's always a scary thing. Shawn, I think we could spend quite a bit of time talking about this, but I'd be curious to get your thoughts first on it.
I'm just rereading it to make sure I understand. Oh, okay. That is really good. That's pretty tricky. I don't know that I have a really good answer for that. If the code is tied to a database change, yeah, that would be a tricky one to handle. I might actually have to defer to you, Bob, on that one.
Yeah, when I first saw that, one of my thoughts is going to be around the length of time between when you rolled back, sorry, when you rolled out and then you're making that decision to roll back. If it's a few minutes, 15, 20, 30 minutes, even all the way up to an hour, hopefully you're not having those changes. They're not any sort of database changes that are not part of the old version of the release. But if you're going back several releases after hours upon hours, you're increasing that risk. And kind of goes back to one of the earlier slides that we showed where the length of time between when you did that deployment and when you are making that decision to roll back, if it's a significant amount of time and your users have been in the system quite a bit, that's you're increasing that risk for data loss. And at that particular point, I would go back to defaulting to rolling forward. The last thing in the world that I would hate to have happen is if you lost any sort of data. And that's why I go back to, if you think there's going to be a little bit of database changes or anything along those lines, maybe one of the steps that you have in your rollback process, if you have the tooling, do some sort of comparison between, hey, this is the database that we were expecting to see. This is the database we have now. Is there any sort of delta? If there is any sort of delta, then you kind of abort your rollback and go, no, this isn't allowed at all. That's a good question. So another question that came in is, what are your recommendations on automating rollbacks? Shawn, I'm going to let you answer that first, but I have a couple thoughts as well about that.
Automating rollbacks, you have your pros and your cons for doing it automatically. I mean, if you're just talking about writing up the process, as we demonstrated, I think that's great. But if you're just gonna throw in a rollback because a deployment failed, you could potentially get yourself into a pickle depending on what changes were made. So you're going to want to make sure that the way that you have your deployment is going to be easily correctable should you run into that type of situation.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You don't want to get yourself into that pickle, like you said. And I would kind of look at history, basically. Like if you're making those decisions, like we're rolling back because of this, we're rolling back because of this. And if it's a consistent decision that you're making each time, or there's some sort of key indicator that, yes, this is an indicator that we need to roll back, then that's what I would add into some sort of automated check that would say, hey, do I need to do an automatic rollback? Other than that, I would continue it to be manual and add that automation as you see those patterns come into place, because yeah, you don't want to get yourself into that pickle and start rolling back when you shouldn't roll back. That would be a terrible thing to have happen, especially if it's like a production deployment. Like, oh my gosh, why the heck did this just roll back? I thought it was going to be good. So there's one that specifically for you, Shawn. Does Wildfly or WebSphere have a similar feature as Tomcat, as that parallel deployment we saw in Tomcat?
I didn't look into WebSphere yet. I did take a look at Wildfly to see if I could find one. Granted, I'm not a Wildfly expert, but I didn't see one. I didn't see one that would be easy to implement, such as the parallel deployments feature. So you might be out of luck on that one.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a fair enough question. I mean, I was kind of curious about that myself, especially since we had a step like that, but maybe that is just a feature of Tomcat. And then another one that came in, and this is kind of going back to that .NET example that we had earlier, which was, what we were talking about, redeploying the packages, and that's what my process did that we modified. Is it possible just to simply point IIS at the previously installed directory instead of redeploying? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. That's completely possible, especially if that directory still exists. And that will be kind of one of your first conditions, very similar to that earlier question we got about what happens if I choose an older release to redeploy. Uh, Assuming that you haven't had any retention policies run and cleans up that old release or that old folder, you can absolutely point to that old folder and say, all right, IIS, go ahead and run this. And that would be one of those steps that you would do for uh, like Shawn was showing you, where it would only run on rollbacks. It wouldn't run on any of your deployments or anything along those lines. There's a few other tricks that you would have to do. And we have some very detailed documentation out on our docs, kind of walking you through how to do that. But yes, it is completely possible to do something like that. It's also completely possible to do the same thing with Windows service, and it would just be a matter of restarting that Windows service. But yeah, absolutely. Awesome. And I think we kind of covered that the other one, which was any tips on rolling back database changes. And I think my answer to that will still be roll forward if you have database changes. Cool. Those were all really the questions that we had that we got in. If there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you very much, everyone. But before we do go, just a little bit of resources. If you have any questions, specifically around support, go ahead and email our support team. If you have any questions about licensing or anything like that, go ahead and email our sales team. If you want to talk to Shawn or I, you have any questions specifically around this webinar, just a little bit follow-up or anything like that, go ahead and email advice, and we'd be happy to answer those questions. Any future webinars, go ahead and check out our events page. Also, we are actively hiring. We have several different roles, both in the UK, the US, as well as in APAC. So if you go to octopus.com/company/careers. And then finally, if you want to see older recordings, the events page is a great place to see all our older recordings of our webinars. But we also have a number of other videos out on YouTube. So if you go to youtube.com/Octopus Deploy, you can see getting started guides. You can see some how it deploys. You can see some older behind the scenes work about how Octopus works and everything like that. It's kind of fun. But yeah, while you're there, go ahead and hit subscribe. Just helps us out. We'd really appreciate it. And thank you again for attending our webinar. Like we said earlier, a recording of the webinar will be emailed to all the registrants. Typically, it will occur about 24 to 48 hours after this webinar is over. If you want to talk more about safe schema updates, we actually have two webinars coming out. There's a part 1 and part 2. One is later this month, and the one is the very beginning of December. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up with a discussion around remote engineering management at Octopus Deploy. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much, everyone.